Hi, this is Paul. It's the first full week of July after the 4th. Some of you noticed I haven't been putting out quite as many videos as I usually do. Part of that has been that I've been working on a chapter for a project that John Vervaeke is working on. And I learned a lot about myself this week working on that chapter. There was a time in my life when I did a lot more writing, generally shorter things, blog posts and things like that. There's my messy office. Working on the chapter was a good discipline for me. I learned something about myself, and I think it was really helpful developing thought in that more disciplined, organized way than what these videos afford. But it also means less content. And different people use the content in different ways, so that was part of the less content last week. Also, generally speaking, if other things come up in my life, church things, family things, I've had a lot of homeless stuff to do lately, and one of the main homeless people was in jail for 2 years, which is when I got this video channel started, and he's not in jail anymore. So he cuts into my time, but I'm hopeful that he's getting, at least he expresses that he's willing to get into a place, and there are more places right now because of COVID and some state money. So I hope that works out for him, because I've noticed over the years he does better when he's inside. Living against the door against my office is not a place to live. He's not supposed to be here anyway. Anyhow, I want to get a handle on some things. It's a very common phrase, and so often I just type things down and I look at it and I think, now what does that thing mean? What do we mean by getting a handle on things? Rod Dreher had posted a little bit from a sermon from Martin Luther King Jr. from 1957. I've been a big fan of Dr. King's for a very long time, so that's part of the reason he comes up a lot. I wrote my final history paper in college. It wasn't really a thesis. I guess it was sort of a thesis, though. But it was on Dr. King and his Christianity. And I didn't know as much theology then as I know now. If I were to write that paper, it'd be quite a different paper. Just a flat-out brilliant man. Brilliant student. Wasn't a particularly good student in college. Very interesting life. Again, read history. It's a wonderful book, Bearing the Cross. A lot of good stuff in it. There are a number of really good biographies about Martin Luther King Jr. And they'll continue to be written because, as David Garrow found out, recently, more and more things come out sometimes. But this line that Rod Dreher picked up along with some other lines, but really grabbed me, and it came out in my Sunday sermon. Part of the reason I do my rough drafts for Sunday is because even though I keep my church, someone sent me an email today or sent me a message today about he went over to my church channel and was a little horrified by what he found. And he was worried and he told me exactly what he thought of it, which I appreciated. He's worried that it might, offend me, or no, I'm not offended at all. When I go back to my first conversation with Jonathan Peugeot, he asked me about liturgy, and I said, it's a mess. It's not unlike my office. I'm high in openness. That means messiness. And worship at Living Stones is messy. Not as messy as some would like. You have to understand that I worked in the Dominican Republic, and that kind of messiness, that could get really wild. So, in terms of the Christian Reformed Church, it's kind of a interesting mess we have going on here. Anyway, part of the reason I do my rough drafts with this channel is because obviously throughout the week when I'm meditating, pondering, working on my sermon while I'm doing these other videos, these things go back and forth. And I've been doing a lot of sermons on Brett Weinstein has been in my sermons fairly regularly. Game B and some of these things. Of course, most of the people in my church have no idea who Brett is. I try to not put too much of my IDW stuff in my Sunday sermons just because they wouldn't make any sense to the people there, but I don't want to keep all of it out. I want them to get little bits and pieces of it. A few people in my church every now and then will watch some of my videos, so it's a process, okay? But this great line by Dr. King in that sermon, the sermon was on loving your enemies. The sermon was okay, but this line, very Heideggerian, and Dr. King in graduate school was reading Heidegger and the phenomenologists and Tillich, and so in some ways, Dr. King isn't too far from some of the conversations that we're having sort of in the Vervaeke corner of the internet that we're doing. So somehow the isness of our present nature is out of harmony with the eternal oughtness that forever confronts us. This seems fairly Heideggerian in terms of a line like that. But what's so good about that line is because sort of like Heidegger, King is using a language that sort of shocks us, but also is very broad. So the isness of our present nature and the eternal oughtness that confronts us. And so right away, in a sense, you have the manifest image and the scientific image, and that they're right there in that sentence. But that sentence, just right there in the middle of a sermon about loving one's enemies, I'm hearing, I've read a lot of King, and now it's a little rusty. It's a couple decades old, but I hear him used a lot, and I think, how much King have you actually read? It lifts certain quotes, comments, even just, rereading the beginning of David Garrow's Bearing the Cross. King, well, he's a human being, and he was in his 20s when this whole thing broke out and sort of became along the way a disciple of nonviolence, which was a very popular thing in the wake of Gandhi's work to free India from the British Empire. I also read a few years ago a really interesting biography, which is a simultaneous biography of Churchill and Gandhi, and that was really quite an interesting book too. And so this little phrase that we use all the time, getting a handle on things. If you just pause and think about that, things is about just everything, and a handle. Why a handle? And again, you can get to the Vervaeke stuff about grasping, and we want to get a handle on things. And part of what happens when I listen to someone long enough, like Jordan Peterson or John Vervaeke, is they sort of take up residence in my consciousness congress. And so there's a little John Vervaeke in my head. Now, he's low resolution, and he's different from the real one, and that's where we hit transcendence, as Jordan Peterson talked to Roger Scruton in that video, where, the little Vervaeke in my head and the Vervaeke that I talk to on the screens, and hopefully someday the Vervaeke who I'll get to shake his hands and give him an embrace and get to know him flesh to flesh, face to face. I hope that happens. It's looking increasingly unlikely that it won't happen in Thunder. Likely it'll happen in Thunder Bay this coming September. No official word on it, but given everything that's going on, it really seems practically impossible. I don't even know if I can get there from the United States at this point. Anyway. So get a handle on things. It's the specific, which is a handle and something that we wield and can hold, and the universal thing. So getting a handle on things is about, the isness, and not really the isness and the oughtness, but another dimension. This is what we want to do. We want to get a handle on things. We want to get a handle on things because somewhere inside of us, our will wants to make things better, to turn our isness into oughtness. I sometimes wake up early in the morning and I don't want to bother my wife, so I just lay in bed and I think about, if I'm going to make a video today, what do I want to talk about? And I was thinking a lot about the anti-racism stuff, which is, of course, all over the place. There's been one of my videos that has gotten just a lot of traction since George Floyd, and it's sort of become a test for me how much this is in the zeitgeist, because it's sort of peaked and got a whole bunch of new subscribers to the channel and all of that, and it's sort of winding down, and that's sort of a natural process. But I was thinking about the comparison this morning between anti-racism and anti-smoking, and thinking about this idea that trying to fix the world through shame-based anti-racism is like trying to fix American healthcare through shame-based anti-smoking. Now, it certainly is the case that a number of people's lives and a number of contexts and a number of situations could be better if people wouldn't smoke. That's just a fact. And I think that's true about racism. Racism is an ongoing problem, and if you watch my video on racism, I don't think we will be rid of racism this side of the second coming of Christ. It will always be with us one way or another. Smoking is still an issue, but if you think that getting rid of smoking will somehow fix healthcare in America, no, it won't. And the same thing with a lot of these other ideas about, if we can somehow get rid of the statues and somehow shame people into being anti-racist, and somehow all of the problems and the kinds of communities that I have lived in and ministered to will somehow go away. And I think you're just setting people up for disappointment, because there's going to be another police kill. It's another unarmed black man is going to die in police custody. It's just simply going to happen. And people are going to freak out. I thought we didn't do anything. And again, it's sort of like, I thought we had smoking. Well, guess what? If you got rid of 100% of smoking in America, which is not going to happen, if you got rid of 100% of smoking in America, how much difference would that make in the problems of the American health care system? Think about it that way. Some things might be better, but it's tiny compared to the scope, the delta between the isness and the oughtness. This whole anti-racism meme the handle is too small. And in many ways, in terms of violence against African Americans, your socioeconomic factors are far more determinative of whether you'll fall victim to violence than your skin color alone. I know, again, I grew up in a black community. I minister in a black community, significant, about half this church is, third to a half. Most of the leadership of this church is black. So I know people that are on the low end of the spectrum, people who are living on the streets, and then other people who are middle class, upper middle class, even wealthy African Americans. This is kind of like Scott Adams. How many black Harvard graduates are falling victim to this kind of violence? It has a lot more to do with socioeconomic factors, and this is also true if you're white. It's the same thing. A lot of the violence going on against people is a function of a lot of other things. Skin color sometimes being a factor, but it's fairly far down the list. And this is also true of police violence. Now, police violence is a tiny part of violence against blacks and a tiny part of violence against whites. And more white people suffer violence against police than black people do. And percentage-wise, again, it's probably out of whack, but listen to Glenn Lowry. He's an economist. There's so many factors involved in these kinds of equations that just yelling racist at people isn't really going to do much of anything in this culture. Now, that being said, I have many black friends. Thinking of one in particular who's actually a lawyer, and he's a wealthier man than I am, and he's got higher status than I do, and he works in politics, and he would regularly, for a while, he was saving his monies and saving his pennies and driving a kind of a crummy car, and he would regularly get pulled over down here on Florin Road by the cops. And this is driving while black, and you get pulled over more. And again, I think this is a problem, and it's part of the problem, and police have, I think, been trying to deal with this. But I think part of the offense that my friend had, now he grew up poor, and he escaped poverty and the ghetto through the sacrifice of his mother. But my friends who are doing well, my black friends who are doing well socioeconomically, are often more offended at these incidences of driving while black or bias that they suffer because of the violation of the expectation that they imagine, well, once I reach a level of status and respectability and dress a certain way and act a certain way, that, they're going to be, pulling over these kids joyriding through the neighborhood more than me, certainly. And then when it happens to them, well, they're much better in tune with the kind of racism that can be around. And, you can hear John McWhorter talk about these kinds of things too. But now, economics is a bigger handle and probably a better handle. And part of the reason I'm using this slide, you can find Dr. King there. He wasn't a very tall man, wasn't a very big man, but there he's in that crowd, and he's, obviously taking part in the march. And none of the signs, most of the signs in the march are about jobs. We march for jobs, jobs for all now, okay? Because, again, if you read enough Dr. King, you'll understand that at a certain point, as his visibility continued to rise, as his work got more and more on a national scope rather than Montgomery and the Montgomery bus boycott, he began to realize what a critical factor poverty was. And whereas blacks are disproportionately poor in America, most American poor are white. And again, this is a function of the population, as with many of these things. And I remember when I read Hillbilly Elegy, and in fact, many of the members of my family read Hillbilly Elegy, and my mother's comment was, "This is like Patterson for white folks." And because many of the issues that you'll find in Appalachia are similar to the issues that you'll find in African American ghettos in North America, things that I grew up with. Some of these things are a function of poverty as much, if not more, than a function of race. And so, we work on these things. And so but then you look at things like, well, my guess is that most dramatic economic mobility is seen in non-white immigrants. People come here from Nigeria, from the Caribbean, from other places in Africa, from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from China, from Korea, from Vietnam, from Laos. People come from all over the world. They come here with almost nothing, and some of them wind up doing very, very well. And many of these people are non-white, and they're immigrants. And so economics are doing better. And so it runs counter to the skin color bias narrative. And, I was looking at something in the news today and just thinking about the fact that, it's this skin color narrative is just such a low resolution way of filtering these ideas. It's to bank this much stuff on it, it just seems foolish and actually foolhardy to me. Glenn Loury did a conversation with David Kaiser, who is significantly to the left of Glenn Loury in terms of his politics and his perspective. He's a historian, but it was really quite a good conversation, I thought. Economics is a bigger handle than race to try to get a handle on things. And money is easier often to count and track because it's so prone to be able to be tracked by numbers. Money is broader because it's so fungible. All kinds of things can be a function of economic, healthcare, distraction, generosity, power. And David Kaiser said something in this conversation with Glenn Loury, which I found quite compelling. He said, really, the real privilege is money. And if you have the kind of money that you have access to, and there's the kinds of things that money affords you access to, you will simply just have more privilege. And if your parents have money, and if you grow up in a community that has money, there have been some interesting studies about, people who grow up in the Bay Area as opposed to Appalachia or something like that. The amount of money in your personal networks, the amount of money in your family networks. I mean, human beings, these networks are so complex that money is a bigger handle. And when he says money is the real privilege, I think David Kaiser really makes a point. But part of what many of you have heard me said many times is that economics is still not big enough. And this is where, in many ways, I differ from Eric and Brett Weinstein. Tom Brady, after winning how many Super Bowls, marries a supermodel, is white, good looking. I mean, you'd have to imagine, well, Tom Brady's done a lot to earn his privilege, certainly, but the gifts he had, plus the hard work, plus I know others who have been in professional sports, and many of them tell me, whether or not you actually get into the big leagues has everything to do with, does this team have this need at this time? And I was going to turn off notifications on my watch, otherwise I get distracted, just like I got distracted now. There's hosts of things go into that. Think about Barack Obama, and certainly, again, or you could use Donald Trump for that matter. Wealthy, advantaged, went to the right schools, had the right people, goes far beyond economics. Howard Hughes had all that money. Look where that brought him. Jeffrey Epstein, Bill Gates. And in many ways, YouTube, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. All of them famous, wealthy men. Economics still isn't a big enough handle, and I think that's part of the problem when we hear people kind of boiling things down to economics. Well, economics it's a bigger handle than race, but it's still not big enough. And I just bumped the computer. So how do we get a handle on things? How do we get the isness in more harmony with the eternal oughtness that forever confronts us? The handle being the specific in terms of our action, and the universal in terms of things. I think about Sevilla picked up on the line that I used in the video before this. Religion is the JPEG of being. Religion is it's the lowest level of the stack that we have. It covers the most places. Now, again, understanding religion, in much more of a Durkheimian way, and even broader than that. I mean, and we hear this again and again, religion that's not a religion. And Alistair McGrath saying to Brett Weinstein, it almost sounds like you're proposing a new religion. It's that layer, it's that level of the stack that we really start to get at the isness and try to compare it to the oughtness. But again, you've got the difficulty of the specific and the very large. In order for, and this is kind of Plato and Aristotle, right? In order for it to be really true, it's got to be really big. But in order for it to be really powerful and really true in another sense, it's got to be really specific. It's got to be right here, right now. And I remember Jordan Peterson talking about the fact that people don't get unstuck until you get to the theological language. And he figured that out as a clinical psychologist. And Sevilla King, whose work was in psychology as well, really got to that point. Sevilla's an interesting person because she's got the art on one hand and the psychology on the other. So we can call this the handle things problem. Handle is about wielding, how. And when as a pastor, it is very common for someone to sit down with me in a degree of distress. Okay, what's wrong? Well, most of the conversation will be about them just talking out loud, processing out loud to try to figure out what's wrong. Peterson makes exactly the same comment as a clinical psychologist. Most of the work is figuring out what's wrong. And when we ask what's wrong, well, lots of things are wrong. And what we're really looking for is a handle. And again, this is very much relevance realization. Okay, I'm feeling angst. I'm feeling dis-ease. I have a sense of distress, and I need to do something to make things better. I need to get a handle on things. And again, it's right there built in the language. And so often, so many of these things are right there in the language. And if we sort of pause and look at a very common phrase like this, get a handle on things, we might learn something. So handle is about wielding, and things are about everything. And again, if you see this slide here with Tom Holland with this quote from the Dellingpod podcast, imagine you've got to write a story in which for the first time somebody who suffers the excruciating death of a slave is going to be cast as being in some way part of the Creator God who fashioned everything, and he's got to be convincing. So right there, in a sense, Jesus, and my argument is that these people are looking for game B, and I think, well, if you really want to improve the world for better, you might look at Jesus. Well, why? Well, because first of all, look what he accomplished, and you can go back to Sunday's rough draft where I lay this out, and I've laid this out many, many times in many different areas. So here's a guy who lives 2,000 years ago, never leads a government, never writes a book, never leads an army, doesn't seem to coerce anyone. Now, you might be skeptical about the supernatural and the miracles, but this is basically what grabbed Tom Holland, is that he said, between the Greeks and us, the world has changed dramatically, and a whole lot seems to have to do with Christianity. And I think in some ways, that's a huge argument that that I can't go into the whole thing, but if you're looking for somehow to save the world, I think Jesus should be at the top of your list in terms of examples that have changed the world dramatically. So now you might want to include the Buddha and Muhammad and Confucius and some of these other characters, but notice they're all religious. And so in this paper that I was writing last week, one of the things that dawned on me is that there's only currently really one American whose birthday is a national holiday. Washington and Lincoln sort of got put together into President's Day. Now, here in California, President's Day is really Washington's birthday, and California celebrates Lincoln's birthday, so fair enough. But if you look at probably some of the most determinative cultural persons in the history of America, it's littered with preachers. City on a Hill, spoken by a preacher. I think it was a preacher. I could be wrong. Ooh, I better check that. Jonathan Edwards, Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. is arguably the most influential American of the 20th century, and by many people, I think, has done more to shape the moral imaginary, at least from the 1970s to the 2010s. Now, we'll see if... Here's the thing about people who are in recent history. We don't know if they'll last. Now, Washington put him in granite, but we don't know if he'll last. Statues of Columbus have been coming down. Statues of all kinds of people have been coming down. So we'll have to see if he lasts. But again, if you're looking at game B, I would say take a look at Jesus, because... And read Tom Holland's Dominion. Someone quipped on Twitter. Paul, read Tom Holland's Dominion, Vanderclay. Every video he tells it, and you'll see that cover in just about every video, because the point he makes I find to be a tremendously compelling point. Well, why start with Jesus? Well, for me, it's obvious, because he's at hand. He's a figure I know a lot about. Jesus, I think, is the most effective world changer for the better that we've seen in history. And we can actually track him with some case studies. And it's very trackable because the Christian church is, as compared to many things, quite well documented. And as Tom Holland, I think, demonstrated in The Shadow of the Cross, Christianity is better documented than the rise of Islam. And so my argument is begin with the Gospels. They're contextual. We know some things about the context, and there are at least some writings from that period. More than we have from the Buddha. In some ways, more than we have at the foundation of Islam. I don't know Confucius well enough to talk about that. But part of both the strength and the weakness of what you have with the Bible is that the Bible is a library. And again, listen to the first of Jordan Peterson's biblical series on the Bible. It's a library, and some of the passages in the Bible are very, very old, long predate in one form or another the Bible itself. And it was written over, shouldn't be fast periods, should be vast periods of time, and had multiple authors, most of whom we don't know, and multiple contexts, and has been the most studied book in the history of the world by far. But part of the challenge that you have in the Bible is lots of contexts. And so what are we trying to do? We're trying to get a handle on things, okay? Now, if you've been listening to my video long enough, if you float the word salvation in front of me in the right context, I'll have you pause and say, what do you mean by that? Now, there's a reason salvation, just like getting a handle on things, is a word we commonly use, because in many ways it's a word that melds a contextual situation and human desires and consciousness. They all come together. And the word salvation keeps consciousness in the picture like many other things don't. You're not going to find the word salvation in the scientific image. You'll find it all over and deeply held in the manifest image. Our scientific habit is to first eliminate consciousness, but you can't do that with a thought. But you can't do that with a thought experiment like this, because Rose says of Jack in Titanic, he saved me in every way a woman could be saved. Okay, well, what do you mean by saved? Well, you survived the sinking of the Titanic thanks to his help. Good for you. You escaped a bad marriage, and he helped with that. Good for him. There's a quality to that romantic relationship which guided your life in a way that towards the end of your life you value highly. Okay, good there. And so right there in that little word, that's why it's so fudgy, but it's also why it's so powerful. That word salvation, or that concept of saved, is so important. And one of the things early on in my college career was that word saved took up a certain resonance and a certain code within evangelicalism, not quite as much in my Dutch Reformed context, but pretty significantly. And right away, when I started reading and then started learning Greek and the New Testament, said, this word is used for a lot of different things, much more in keeping with how we use it in vernacular English. It's always personal, and there's always a conscious aspect to it. Now, in many ways, let's just take a little trip through some aspects of the Bible. What was Abraham looking for? Abraham was looking for children, and so Abraham was looking for heirs. And so when God shows up and says, I'm going to make a great nation out of you, and the whole context of the Abraham cycle is, will he have a son? Will he have a son? On what terms? Can it be Lot be his heir? Can his servant be his heir? Will Ishmael be his heir? And then, of course, Isaac will come. Laughter, and it's a joke. But so salvation for Abraham was heirs, to not be cut off. Jacob, Jacob's always trying to save his skin, and Jacob's always trying to succeed. And so in many ways it's survival, and he flees Esau to fall into the clutches of Uncle Laban, and Laban doesn't necessarily treat him that well. God, of course, at Bethel says, I'm going to bless you, and Jacob is a little doubtful, says, okay, well, I'll cut you in on 10% if you do. Well, there you go, Jacob. You've taught us a lot about the way you view the world. So then, of course, he's fleeing Laban, and hears that Esau is coming towards him with 400 men, and he parcels out his family, so maybe he'll start taking herds and sons and wives. And then, of course, God visits Jacob at the Jabbok, and they wrestle, and God takes from Jacob the one thing that he would count on in order to flee, which is his capacity to run. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. And so that was in many ways his salvation, which was survival. And later on, when you read the story about Shechem and Dinah, Jacob's obsession over the people of the land will turn on us. He's always trying to save his skin. And then later, his two favorite sons of Joseph and Benjamin. Israel, what is salvation for Israel? Well, when you get into groups, things get more abstract because they're a collective. And so Israel wanted world domination. They wanted supremacy. They wanted security. They wanted realization of their dreams. Here they have the temple of the Lord, and this is going to secure for them all of this stuff. And of course, the Babylonians come and destroy the temple, and the second temple is built, and those who remember the first temple mourn because the second temple was not like the first temple. And then Israel is living in exile in their land, and they're living subjected to, first the Babylonians, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans. And you get all the way to the first century, and then we have these four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they're all four different perspectives. Mark, possibly the record of Peter's preaching. Luke, obviously connected with Paul. John, the whole Johannine corpus of the New Testament. John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, the book of Revelation. And so they all have different perspectives, but a lot of what they share is context. So you have the first century in Galilee and Judea. Nearly 10% of the Roman Empire. The Jews make up nearly 10% of the Roman Empire. They did spread out in their diaspora. In many ways, they did flourish. And life in the Galilee and Judea was economically less than other places in the empire. And so the temple in Jerusalem was dependent upon the religious faithful making their pilgrimages back to the temple and all the money that would come back into Jerusalem. And then I think a careful reading of the New Testament, of the Gospels, suggested that many of the individuals that Jesus was, many of his disciples had family relations down in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem sort of was a special place where, if you were a very observant, dedicated Jew, you had places to stay around Jerusalem and friends and family to stay with, because people were always going down to Jerusalem for the feast days and the sacrifices, and the life of the nation and their identity went around, was surrounded by that. Part of what we actually have from the first century also are the writings of Josephus, who is a very interesting guy, and in terms of New Testament scholarship, people go back and forth on how trustworthy those writings are. But for many years in the Christian Reformed Church, if people would have the Bible and they'd have a copy of Josephus, because Josephus was sort of like being able to read other things around it, and you get this very particular perspective from Josephus about the Jewish revolt that happened 68 to 70, 71 AD, the destruction of the temple. Josephus chronicles a bunch of those things. But what's the context of that Jesus speaks to? You can't read the Gospels, and again, I've told this story before, when I grew up in the church, going to church, to get to college, even though I went to a Christian college, Calvin College, not like Wheaton, you didn't have to take a pledge. You don't want to go to church on Sunday morning, you don't go to church. You don't want to go to Bible study, you don't study the Bible. You want to go to Calvin College and not be a Christian? Go to Calvin College and not be a Christian. The school, they had limits. It was a dry campus, but the school had limits in terms of what you would do, but the school wasn't there to try to make you a Christian. That's part of that Dutch tolerance. And so that was part of the charm of Calvin College. So I go to Calvin College and have to decide, well, how do I want to live now? There's plenty of Bible studies and churches around if I want to be a Christian. And so I start reading the New Testament, and really for the first time in my life, trying to figure out, what on earth is this book about? Why are there so many stories about eating on Sunday and lepers and tax collectors? Well, it's all contextualized because of the Roman subjugation. And if you don't understand that historical context, well, all of Jesus' words in many ways are situated in that context. And that makes the amazing literary feat that Tom Holland recognizes even the more outstanding, that even within that particular context, even though there's plenty of misreading going on with the Gospels, Jesus shines out as just so both attractive and mysterious and compelling that those books continue to work for people. And again, in the Jordan Peterson sphere here, plenty of people started reading the Bible. Okay, they started reading the book of Genesis because Jordan was talking about it, and they start reading the Gospels. And boy, this Jesus is something else. And that shines through even through the furnishings of the Roman subjugation of the Galilee and Judea in the first century, between just rough numbers 0 and 35. And then, of course, the epistles. Well, we'll get to those in a minute. Now, there's an ethnic religious context going on that isn't explained by the Gospels at all, which is partly why you want to go to a church that has a pastor with some degree of education, because hopefully he can be helpful in at least giving you a little bit, a low-resolution take on some of this to understand what the book is talking about. But you've got, in the midst of this poly-everything Roman Empire, a unique people with some high expectations about God's deliverance for them and an outsized resistance to assimilation. It's one of the most astounding things about the Jewish culture and the Jewish people. Just phenomenal how they've survived as a distinct cultural group. I mean, what other religions do you know that date back that far? That gets into a whole nother thing, but it's an astounding thing. And so really the struggle of the Jews under the Roman occupation it's a big part of those first 4 Gospels. You can't understand the shape of the Gospels and the history without taking all of this into account. Okay? So how do we try to get a handle on things? Well, how is it that Jesus helps us get a handle on things when we're hearing stories that are so deep in that context, and Jesus somehow continues to shine through? And Jesus did this, and again, those of you who listen to my videos will have heard me make this point again and again and again. I did an interview with Unsafe Space last week, and I went through a bunch of these points again. Jesus did this in a culture war which was fiercer than ours. And I've been thinking a lot about what the mob does. You can read Douglas Murray's The Madness of Crowds. Mob thinking. Human beings are very susceptible to mob thinking. We will do things in mobs we won't do any other way. We will lose our minds in mobs, and we do tremendous damage in mobs. And some good evolutionary psychologists, Brett Weinstein, can probably tell you, well, these are or Jordan Peterson, these are these programs that when we get into big groups and certain things trigger us, and off we go to do violence and destruction in the group. Well, Jesus' culture war was fiercer than ours. It was more violent than ours. It was more individually dangerous than ours. And there have been many much more dangerous culture wars. Look at the Dirty War in Argentina. Look at they're common throughout the history of the world. Basically, what you do is you mob up and you enforce the cohesion of your mob by basically tyrannizing everyone within it. And one of the early things I heard out of Jordan Peterson that I thought was absolutely brilliant, of course he got it from Solzhenitsyn, which is that you at some point have to self-tyrannize. And what's amazing, Brett Weinstein pointed this out recently, part of what's happening with a lot of this woke indoctrination is that what it's doing is it's leading certain groups of people to self-tyrannize in order basically for this system to mob up, so that people will start doing things that they would think unthinkable but now are necessary and justified because of the alarming danger of whatever the thing is that you're imagining, capitalism or white supremacy or patriarchy or communism, people will level up and mob up for all sorts of reasons. And this was going on in Jesus' day. You had the Roman way, which by the beginning of the millennium was the way of the world. You had the Pax Romana. It was the cutting edge of history. It was most successful way that Rome conquered all of these people. Now, I wrote about that in my paper, and maybe I should do a video that kind of runs through my paper. Probably a good exercise for me to sort of think it out loud. But the Roman way was the way, and many Jews were convinced of that. They were making money with it. The Romans were successful. And then you had others who were saying, no, this is corrupting us. This is against God's will. We have to resist it. And the menu of ways of resisting: run out into the desert and hide in a hole like the Essenes, or fight it violently in the streets. Antifa, basically the Zealots were Antifa for the Jewish Liberation Front. If you watch Monty Python and the Life of Brian, there's a lot in Monty Python that the Life of Brian, it mocks, but it communicates and translates into our context. Jesus was very anti-mob, and he paid the price for it. But he was also very skillful with the mob, which, again, that's part of what makes him compelling. And part of why I think Jesus is someone who should be studied in this context is not only is he, in my opinion, the most successful human being to game be the planet, but he lived in a culture war that was at least as fierce as ours. At least ours is right now. And I think many have navigated fierce culture wars by being like Jesus, and I think Christianity in many ways defeated mob violence time and time again, which is part of the reason why the West has been able to maintain democracy. So Jesus was very skillful in dealing with these powerful factions. And when you look at how he dealt with Pontius Pilate, when you look at how he dealt with the religious authorities, but he spends most of his attention, interestingly enough, and again, this is contextual, addressing the conservative religious mob. And partly because, in many ways, he was closest to them. And generally speaking, mobs have their fiercest wrath against those who are closest to them but seem traitorous. That's, in a sense, that's the gravitation that mobs create. And so they turn him over to the Romans. And again, the point that I've made, of course, the Jewish nationalists and the Romans couldn't agree on anything, but the one thing they could find agreement on was that Jesus should be dead. And in fact, they had to do a little bit of talking the Romans into that and release Barabbas and kill Jesus. Now, part of what's interesting about the New Testament is that, and the book of Acts sort of chronicles this, but remember Luke and Acts, remember who Luke is. And so very quickly, this jumps out of the story of what's happening in Galilee and Judea and very quickly goes out to the rest of the empire. I mean, it goes up to Antioch, and of course there's persecution amidst the diaspora Jews who are in Jerusalem. They're the ones, the deacons, they're the ones who flee. The apostles stay put. And, there's lots and lots of layers to this, and you can catch some of my commentary on this in some of my sermons. But the story jumps to the larger Roman Empire context very quickly. The Jewish context nearly disappears as the Gentile part of the church quickly swamps the Jewish response to Jesus. And, this happened over a fair amount of time, but the Gentile part of the church just got so large that, part of, the Judaizers and Paul and Peter, all of those struggles are very early struggles to sort of figure out, can these Jews who believe in Jesus and the Gentiles actually become one church to the degree that we can call anything in the first 2 centuries of the history of the church sort of one church? You almost get the sense that this sort of goes out into the empire. And, Paul goes out, of course, but one of the things that you find is that many other individuals had gone out in tiny little, Game B would call it spore mode, that these spores went out and started growing in tiny, tiny ways in tiny, tiny places. And the Roman Empire was a very big thing. And obviously, if you read the book of Acts, many in synagogues eventually had heard enough of Paul and kicked him out. Didn't like him at all. And the one thing that Paul seemed to have going is he'd cause riots everywhere he went. And Even on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, we've got Jacob, who he's a little curious about Jesus, but Paul he can't stand. So you can go to the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, and Jacob will tell you all about his feelings about the Apostle Paul. And then it's settling out the Jewish aspects take time. And of course, one of the big ways that the Apostle Paul functions is really taking, you read something like the book of James, the Gospel of Matthew, and then you read the epistles of Paul. And Paul is really applying this to this context. And of course, from what we know about the Apostle Paul, and we know quite a bit about the Apostle Paul, he's, Jacob, it's debated. But maybe Jacob should talk to N.T. Wright, someone who knows a lot more than I am. Or anyway, so the Apostle Paul, through him, the church, again, really continues to grow amongst the Gentiles. But that's also true of 1st and 2nd Peter. It's true of the Johannine corpus. But again, when you read James, it gets to the point that Luther calls James an epistle of straw. But there's a quality to the book of James, and again, tradition suggests that perhaps the book of James was somehow attributable to James the Just, who was a brother of Jesus, or depending on who you talk to, a half-brother of Jesus. And Paul talks about how, James eventually comes around with Peter and believing in the risen Jesus, and on and on. But again, the book of James is a different epistle from the Pauline corpus in the New Testament. So you have this emergence beyond the Jewish nationalist context, and Christianity in the empire is going to take a new shape. And of course, one of the early issues you have to deal with are circumcision, meat sacrifice to animals. You'll find that talked about in the Council of Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15. But what that's dealing with are all these cultural issues. And you'll find them, especially in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, where Paul is, 1st Corinthians is in some ways a question and answer session. I'm not sure if I have those recordings on YouTube or not. People have asked that. I've got years of Sunday school audio recordings. I'm not sure how much value they are, but some people have asked that I put them on the web. Maybe I will one of these days, put them in podcast form, because Sunday school isn't going on right now because of COVID, and I really miss it. But so we're beyond the Jewish nationalist context, but we're still situated in a Roman cultural context. And a lot of the questions, meat sacrifice to idols, prostitution, participation in pagan temples, family relations. This son is sleeping with his mother or stepmother, and Paul is horrified. And well, was that a move of status? And then there's just some other very interesting aspects about the book of 1 Corinthians. So we have all these things situated in the Roman cultural context, and we still need to do translation. And again, Ephesians, and I wouldn't say these, and the commentaries on my shelf. So here's Ephesians. This is just my library, and it doesn't include the commentaries. Oh, here's another Ephesians, and First Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. I mean, endless work on this stuff, and we still have to translate it between. So actually, part of the blessing of the New Testament is that we see Jesus in this Galilean Judeo context in the midst of this own particular culture war. Now you get out of the Judean context, and you're out of that culture war, and we get another picture of Christianity from Paul and John and Peter, and so we get this other picture. So now that we've got 2 points of contact about Christianity, well, this is more helpful for one, because the cultural elements of these 2 different points of contact are going to be different. Now, the YouTube algorithm. Just Saturday or Friday or something, I think it was Friday, I pull up YouTube, and what should a Reformed Christian think of Jordan Peterson? I thought, dude, you're about 2.5 years too late. And it's a PCA, Presbyterian Church of America. And those of you who understand the nuances of conservative Reformed churches in America. So PCA, there'd be English Reformation, the Presbyterian, as opposed to the Reformed, which is the Dutch Reformation or the Swiss Reformation, okay, that aspect. And so PCA doesn't allow women in church office, so they're more conservative than the Christian Reformed Church. PCA is a break off of the PCUSA. Tim Keller is a PCA pastor. Generally speaking, PCA pastors are, they're a little bit different from this Dutch Reformed pastor. They have got the Westminster Confession. We've got the Heidelberg Catechism, and so it's interesting. So I listened to him, and part of what I heard was I thought, I've often had people say to me, "Well, Paul, you're not like other pastors." I was thinking, yeah, of course I'm not like other pastors, and then I saw this video and I thought, I guess I can kind of see what they mean. And that isn't a criticism of him, but just the mode at which he sort of sifted through Jordan, well, it was, I guess, quite different from the mode that I did, and now I'm 2 years into this, and so here's the thing. You start in something like this, some people are going to stay in the same place because they're really good at that, and that's a strength, and it's a limitation. I'm a little bit more of a wanderer, which makes people nervous about me, because is Paul going to wander over a line? Well, probably. Maybe I'll jump back over it if I figure out I've wandered over a line. But there's a lot of people, and I completely understand why. They're skeptical about the church's handle on things. And because in many ways what churches sort of do is they say, well, here are these rituals. Here are these beliefs that we want you to subscribe to. Here are these practices we want you to participate in or observe or keep or practice or play, to use Vervaekian language. And if you do these things, you'll have these outcomes. And, some of the outcomes for Christianity are dramatically non-falsifiable, such as going to heaven when you die, or being resurrected with Jesus in the age to come. And I'm not skeptical about these things, which sort of puts me, on the conservative side. I have no problem with the Apostles' Creed. I have no problem with the virgin birth. I have no problem with the second coming. I have no problem with miracles. I don't have any problems with any of those things. But I'm sometimes a little skeptical about the church's programming, because I've seen people go through their programming, and the outcomes are not necessarily what the church always promises. So I understand the skepticism. People feel the need to be saved from blank, and that's usually why they come to church. People will come to church, and the church is small enough that I can usually talk to every visitor, and hopefully maybe have, depending on if they want to talk, anywhere from 10 seconds to a few minutes or 5 or 10 minutes conversation with different visitors. And then I want to know why they're here. I want to know what they're looking for. I want to know what they're looking to be saved from. And those are all over the map in an indescribable way. And churches sort of have a one size fits all solution often, and your mileage may vary. And so what usually happens is we take our one size solution and we sort of read that back over all of the diversity that's in the Bible. Because would Abraham come and look to a church today? He says, look, all I want is heirs. So maybe I'll go to a fertility clinic, and, doctor would take one look at Sarah and say, forget it. Israel in the desert. Well, part of the difficulty that, again, when I first started wrestling with the Bible was this one size fits all doesn't seem to fit all of the things that we have in the Bible. Now, Christianity has very much an idea of progressive revelation, and so by Jesus' time, you sort of weigh that more than necessarily in Abraham's time, and you try to do all those sorts of implicit calculations. But what they were looking for in the monarchy, the salvation they were looking for, what they were looking for from salvation from exile, the salvation that the people around Jesus were looking for in Galilee and Judea. And of course, the apostles, what happens to the apostles, I'm sure, was in no way on their radar when Jesus meets them by the Sea of Galilee and says, "Follow me." Oh, you mean we're going to wander all over the Roman Empire and be killed at some point and, have our lives completely disrupted and still stick with Jesus all the way to death? In Peter's case, be crucified upside down because of him? Wow. Nobody saw that coming. And then one of the things I remember going through the book of Revelation in my adult Sunday school class, when you read the book of Revelation, you read these letters to churches that are in the first part of the book, in chapters 2 and 3. The audacious promises that are given to these churches that you'll overcome. And it's like this tiny little group of, and you read the Johannine, I answer a question for that in the Friday question and answer. And I mean, just read the book of 1 John. It's an amazing book, but it's a shocking book. One moment you have God is love and everybody's like, oh, and the next moment you begin to realize, read 2 John and 3 John, you begin to realize just how strict this little group was. And boy, if you left them, you were Antichrist. So how does it work that on one hand they've got these sayings which are just so marvelous that all kinds of people who are high in openness would grab onto it, but the next paragraph would like, whoa, what this almost sounds like a little cult here. And Peter, Paul, and John out into the Roman Empire, and these goes into spore mode, and these little spores will take root and grow and grow and grow, and 200-300 years later, it's all over the place. And Constantine, Tom Holland makes the point that in the 3rd century, the Roman Empire wasn't doing it very well, and basically part of what was crumbling was the pagan artifice that there's all these gods out there, and having to sacrifice to all these gods, it's costing a tremendous amount of money, and the empire is struggling, and we can't afford these sacrifices. So let's find one god to rule them all. And so a series of emperors try on these different gods, and finally Constantine has the vision at the Milvian Bridge and conquers under Jesus, and Constantine sticks. And so, that's validation that Jesus is, Apostle Paul says it, triumph over the principalities and powers. Romans understood what the Apostle Paul was saying. Secularists, what were these principalities and powers? And so that's part of the reason I talk about them, to try and help us understand what's going on with Paul. But Constantine conquers, and he has a long reign, and that validates Jesus for the empire. But right then you're going to have, it's going to be complicated very quickly. And so, the Roman Empire that the church is engaging in the 2nd century is not the empire. It's changing in the 3rd century, and then in the 4th century, and then in the 5th century. And so you've got the Greek fathers and the early fathers and what they're writing with. And again, most of the stuff we have from them, we got some sermons, but, most of the stuff, they're writing against their adversaries. And it's wild stuff in some ways. And then, of course, Augustine in the Latin side of the church and late antiquity and the City of God, phenomenally important book for the history of Western civilization. Then you have the Middle Ages, and of course you have the Roman Empire, and again, Tom Holland's work is helpful in understanding the Roman Empire and their continual struggle against the Persians. But then, of course, Islam will rise at some point, and then the Western Empire, which is really quite a mess, and all the different barbarian tribes and everything going on. What does salvation mean? And then, eventually in the Middle Ages, you've got, very much again, I should probably do a video on the paper that I wrote last week. It was a good experience for me learning and kind of walking through that stuff. I don't know if the paper's worth anything. I would kind of hold my breath when I hear what John and Christopher have to say about it. Like, what Vanderklay did. I haven't written anything that long since the 1980s. Footnotes. Maybe the last paper I wrote that long, I used a typewriter. had to measure out the little footnotes at the end. It was always a relief when the professor says, you can do endnotes. Whoo! Because, if you're typing along, you're thinking, how many footnotes on this page? Yeah, times were rough, both ways in the snow barefoot typewriting. But what did Christianity mean in the Middle Ages? Well, the sacraments were these portals, and you did the sacraments. And, I get into my paper a little bit of Barfieldian participation, and all of this original participation in some ways gets boiled down into certain sacraments, and those are the portals and the levers. But of course, this continues, and by the time of the Reformation, they're skeptical about that, and how exactly do these sacraments work, and they go from 7 down to 2, and all of the philosophy that Aquinas is working with. And of course, Luther's not, according at least to Brett Sockel, Luther's not reading Aquinas correctly, but trying to, it seems, maybe get at the heart of Aquinas while rebuking Aquinas. I mean, the whole thing's just a mess. But what does Christianity mean in the Middle Ages? What did Christianity mean for Augustine? For Augustine, Christianity embraced it because he was looking to embrace wisdom. That's what Augustine was looking for. And of course, you've got the Neoplatonism that Augustine is deep within, reacting to the Manichaeism that Augustine went into. And I'm reading a little bit more on Augustine right now, too. And then, of course, with the Reformation, you kind of have Charles Taylor's supernova, and boom! All the different churches and all the different manifestations, and in many ways going all over the world. And what's, the interesting comparisons between, let's say, in the modern period, Roman Catholic evangelism versus Protestant evangelism. Protestants long criticized some of the flexibility that the Roman Catholics existed in evangelism. I mean, some pretty sophisticated stuff, sort of mapping saints onto other deities. And again, the more I go down these last years, I'm less reactive to some of these things, because I hopefully understand a little bit more of some of the ancient code from paganism that sort of got carried into Roman Catholic evangelism techniques. And now the Protestants did it very differently, because they're basically working out of early modern code. And so all of this stuff looks terribly different. And then I look at these two guys talking, and so you've got Sean McDowell, and right there he's got Biola, Bible College in Los Angeles there, and he puts that right on his moniker. And so, well, who's he signaling and what? And so you've got evangelicalism, where you can be, so basically what happens in the mainline position is that, well, you got the main line, and then in the 1960s you have the reaction against the main line, because the main line is the man, and evangelicals on one hand are more conservative than the main line because they've got more of that fundamentalist strain in them. On the other hand, they're more flexible in terms of missiology than the main line, which means that in a sense you sort of distill everything down into, in a very Methodistic way, down into that moment of conversion and the confessions and the doctrines. But of course, in the evangelical church, you both have the fragmentation of doctrine, but then a new sub-canon emerges of Bible-believing churches. And I've before talked about Mark Knoll's piece about the way that the Bible functions on the frontier, and so on and so forth. So then we get evangelicals that, part of the horror that this individual, I know he'll watch this, so I won't mention his name because he sent me the private message, but, when I talked to Jonathan Pajot, well, what's your, Jonathan Pajot, want to know what my liturgy was like? You'd be horrified. Poor Jonathan. I checked out at the acrobatics. Well, I don't have any acrobatics, unless... I'm not going to go into it. But, yeah, you'd be horrified. And part of this gets into some of my thinking about what the church is and how it should be led. Because Martin Luther King Jr., when he first went to Dexter Street in Montgomery, one of the first things he does is settles himself in there as the autocrat of the church. That's a very common thing. In a Black Baptist church, the minister is the leader, and the council helps the minister put his vision out there. That's how Black Baptist church works. Dutch Reformed Church works a little differently. I don't instill my vision. I get plenty of my take in this church. Nobody monkeys with my sermons, crazy as they can be, but one of the things I quickly learned here is he who does decides. Now, there are limits there, and I'll say a word now and then if something seems a little bit over a line that I feel, but my office is a mess. I got homeless people outside. I'm pretty darn high in openness. And so I'll tolerate a lot more than most of the people in the church, but that's why, in a sense, I let them regulate it more than me. So right here, we have the ongoing work of the church, the theological and the practical, and it's astounding in its diversity. And what's amazing is that the thread isn't simply lost at all. In some ways, that's the real miracle of the church. And my reading of Alistair McGrath's book Heresy is a fairly Darwinian one, in that the thread is seen through the long-term view of the church. And you might have heresies that go for 200, 300, 400, 500 years. But they'll peter out. They might come about again. Sam. They might come about. Sam's of course our favorite heretic, and Jacob is on the Discord server. Jacob is our Pharisee, and Sam is our non-Trinitarian, and we've got our Buddhists, and we have our atheists, and we have all different folks, and I like it that way because I learned from all these different folks, and we have our Vervaeke fans, and we have our Peterson fans, and we have our folks who don't like Peterson much, and on and on and on and on. And I like that vast open territory. But the work of the church is seen over the very long period of time when we learn what kinds of things finally don't live. Because in many ways, that which survives, that which endures, is what rules and what's most real. And so, we've got the super traditional, and I didn't appreciate that about the Orthodox until, listening to a lot of Peugeot and, a couple of the conversations I had with Nathan Jacobs. I mean, the Orthodox Church is very serious about not changing. And I respect that. And I'm glad they're here, and I think they very much have their place in the North American missiological field. And I think the mainline has its place, and all of the different flavors of conservative reformed have their place. And again, it doesn't mean I agree with everything, but in a sense, if it's working its niche in the ecosystem, there's a reason for it. Ontology has its own justification. And so in time, God will tend his garden. And there's the wheat and the tares, and they grow up together. And so we're feeling our way forward, and, listening to John Steingard, and doesn't like the word sin, and, been listening to Jordan Peterson quite obviously, and maybe over there at Rebel Wisdom, and is looking to do some shadow work, and he's feeling his way through. This is what people do. So what do I do as a Christian? I try to help them maybe feel at a little higher resolution, feel a little better. Do I have my agenda? Sure. We all have our agendas. But I'll try and understand that I'm me and you're you, and I'm going to respect you as an image bearer of God, and I'm going to respect the work that the Holy Spirit, Lord willing, is doing in your life, and I'm going to try and be helpful. And of course, there are limits to that. There are things I won't help people with. There are many things I can't help people with. But given the body of knowledge I have, I'll try and help. And now, of course, if I only had 100 subscribers to my YouTube channel, it'd be a little easier. But I do the best I can. So where was I going with this? How to get a handle on things. So somehow the isness of our present nature is out of harmony with the eternal oughtness that forever confronts us. And so now with COVID-19, we had 21 people at Livingstone's on Sunday. Maybe this week I'll get further on getting our little church app going up and going, so more people who watch me on YouTube can come over and be horrified to see what this pastor actually does in his with his church. I finally have to stand before one judge about what I do with my church. It's not my church. That's part of the point of why it's such a mess. It's not my church. It belongs to Jesus and belongs to the council who are ordained, take vows to lead the church and to lead me and with me. And so it's sort of a mess. But part of what I've been thinking a lot about lately is, okay, what does Christianity look like going forward? And again, the Orthodox are going to be there. But I look at what being, now we use a different, we use N.T. Wright's phrase, being the people of God, meaning the God of Israel. Look at what being the people of God meant in all these different contexts. And with the massive dislocation we're seeing from the internet, the massive changes and dislocation from other forms of technology, from what I see of the formation that's happening on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server and the conversations that I mostly overhear, I lurk more than I post, because I don't want to get in the way. And if you think, if you look at all the messiness on Bridges of Meaning, you may be able to understand some of the messiness at Livingstone's. And I get this from my father. My father often gave people enough rope to metaphorically hang themselves. Maybe that's too much, I don't know. So, what does the church look like going forward? Will it look like the past? Yeah. That's where I appreciate Peugeot and Nathan Jacobs and the Orthodox, because it's like, okay, well, there's a point of contact. And I appreciate the Roman Catholics. I say, okay, there's a point of contact. And I appreciate the Protestant Reformation perspective. And I say, okay, now there's a point of contact. And so I look at all these points of contact, and then I see what's going into the future, and I say, okay, what is the church going to look like going forward? Can I be helpful? Will I have a part to play in that? And at this point, it seems God has given me a part to play in that. And so, and all of you who comment have parts to play in that. Those of you who are committed to one form of church or another, and being the watchdogs on your beat in the comment section or in the Bridges of Meaning, that's an important function. And so I listened to the fundamentalists, and I had a question about fundamentalism on this last question and answer. And the question and answers are going to keep changing too, because we're trying to refine them and do better. So yeah, trying to get a handle on things. A Christian trying to get a handle on things. A pastor trying to get a handle on things. That's what we're doing.